Rowena's greatest fear was the mating bond. To her, it wasn't a gift but a prison that crushed autonomy. King Leonardo, a formidable Lycan mourning his first mate, had made a solemn vow. He would only claim another if his ancient primal wolf submitted first. When Rowena fled the ceremony in terror, she sought refuge in the one place she believed was safe, the king's chambers. He found her. The unthinkable happened. He claimed her. But when she ran from the bond, the humiliated king sealed the fortress. Now 2 men hunted her, the king to whom she'd fated, and the treacherous Beta who wanted to use her to destroy him. The howl that cut through the evening air was a sound of utter devastation. It reverberated off the dark stones of the fortress walls, bypassing grief and plunging straight into terror. Rowena watched from the shadows of a stone alcove, her nails digging into the granite until they ached. She shouldn't have been there. This was a private agony, a sacred moment of ruin. Yet she couldn't force herself to leave. In the rain-soaked courtyard, Chloe knelt, her silk gown torn and smeared with mud. Her eyes were vacant, her face pale and frozen in shock. She was a shell of herself. Above her stood Sam, her fated mate, a towering, powerful shifter from the mountain guard. He vibrated with possessive energy, chilling and unyielding. He wasn't offering comfort or solace. No, Rowena realized with a wave of nausea. He was guarding her. He had forced the bond. Rowena recognized the signs. She'd seen it twice before, though never this close. Chloe must have resisted. Her wolf perhaps too young or too defiant to submit to the overwhelming dominance of a fated alpha. Sam, impatient and driven by primal instinct, hadn't waited for her acceptance. He had taken it, shattering her in the process. This was supposed to be the blessing every unmated female craved, the sacred union of 2 souls, the completion of self. But Rowena saw it for what it truly was, a colonization. She pressed deeper into the shadows, the cold stone seeping through her thin tunic. To her, the mating bond was not a gift, but a cage. It was the ultimate loss of self, a complete surrender of will. Your mind no longer belonged to you. Your emotions were tethered to another's. Your essence was hollowed out to make room for him. Rowena remembered Chloe from the kitchens, quick with laughter, sharp with wit. Now, the only sound she made was a thin, broken wail that escaped her lips without notice. Sam reached down, his hand gripping Chloe's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of tenderness, but an act of ownership. "You are mine," he growled, his words a threat rather than a promise. Rowena's stomach churned. This was her future. Her breath hitched as she forced herself to retreat, step by silent step. The image of Chloe's broken form burned in her mind, a stark reminder of what awaited her if she didn't escape. The thought of being claimed, of losing herself entirely, filled her with dread. For Rowena's freedom was everything, and yet fate seemed determined to strip it away. When she finally slipped into the safety of the castle's labyrinthine halls, her heart pounded with both fear and resolve. She couldn't let this happen, not to her. Not like this. But even as she vowed to fight, she knew the odds were against her. The king's primal wolf had bowed, marking her as his. And somewhere in the shadows, the traitorous Beta plotted, seeing her as a weapon to wield against the throne. Rowena was caught between 2 dangers, each more perilous than the last. Her only hope lay in finding strength she didn't know she possessed, and allies she wasn't sure she could trust. As she moved through the dim corridors, Rowena clung to the fragments of her identity, praying they wouldn't be swept away in the storm ahead. Rowena stood frozen, her breath trapped in her chest, as the deep, resonant toll of the bell echoed through the fortress. The sound reverberated in her ears, each strike a reminder of what awaited her. This was not an alarm, but a summons, the call to the great mating ceremony she had dreaded all her life. Presided over by the king himself, it loomed over her like a shadow she could never escape. Her gaze darted between Sam's cold, unyielding presence and Chloe's vacant stare, her heart pounding wildly as if trying to break free from its cage. The bell rang again, sealing her fate. Every unmated female of age was required to attend. There would be no running, no hiding. Even if she fled this courtyard, the fortress walls would trap her, and beyond them, the king waited. Inside the fortress, King Leonardo stood alone in his private study, a room cloaked in shadows and heavy silence. Stark high windows framed the storm-tossed cliffs outside, their gray turmoil mirroring the emptiness within him. He was a figure carved from darkness, black fur, polished leather, power that pressed against the air like a tangible force. Yet his eyes betrayed nothing, as lifeless as the churning sea beyond the glass. Since the passing of his mate 2 seasons ago, duty had become a hollow burden, a cruel echo of what once gave his life meaning. Now he was merely a ghost haunting his own court, a king stripped of everything but the weight of his title. The tolling of the bell reached him too, pulling him reluctantly back to the present. It was a sound tied to obligation, one he resented with every fiber of his being. Lord Timothy, his beta and oldest friend, hesitated at the doorway before clearing his throat softly. Their bond, forged since childhood, had weathered much, but even Timothy struggled under the weight of Leonardo's grief. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "they are waiting. The ceremony cannot proceed without you. The pack alphas grow restless." Leonardo didn't turn. His gaze remained fixed on a lone seabird battling the wind above the cliffs. His voice, when it came, was low and bitter. "Then let it fail. It is a charade, a pointless, disrespectful mockery." Timothy stepped further into the room, his sturdy frame a stark contrast to the king's spectral stillness. "It is your duty," he insisted, frustration creeping into his tone despite his efforts to remain calm. "The packs need stability. They need assurance that the lineage will continue. Your wolf—" "My wolf needs nothing," Leonardo snapped, his voice a dangerous growl that seemed to shake the very air around them. Turning sharply, he pinned Timothy with a glare so cold it could freeze fire. "My wolf is ancient. It is weary. It does not stir for these hopeful children paraded before me. To suggest otherwise is an insult to her memory." His hand closed tightly around a small, smooth riverstone resting on his desk. It was the only object in the room that held any warmth, a relic he had refused to let anyone touch since her death. She had found it on the riverbank where they first met, and now it served as both a reminder and a lifeline to the love he had lost. For all the grandeur of his surroundings, it was this tiny stone that anchored him to the world. Without it, he feared he might truly become the ghost everyone already saw. Grief weighed heavily on him, a cold and unyielding presence lodged deep within his core. It had long since extinguished the fire of his primal instincts, leaving behind only an empty chill. Once again, he found himself in the ceremony hall, just as he had been the year before, dutifully fulfilling what he believed to be a meaningless ritual. He sat upon the throne, his wolf dormant, its spirit disgusted and repelled by every female brought before him. Each introduction was met with silent disdain, an unspoken rejection that echoed louder than words. "Leonardo," Timothy began, abandoning formal titles for familiarity. His tone softened into something akin to pleading. "You must give it a chance. Perhaps one of them will awaken the bond. How else can you know unless you are there?" "There?" Leonardo let out a sharp laugh devoid of humor. "I am here, always here, and yet it changes nothing. They are unworthy. None of them could ever measure up to her." Timothy's composure finally cracked, frustration boiling over. "Then tell me, what is your intention? Do you wish for the bloodline to end, for chaos to consume the court? Your grief is a luxury this kingdom cannot afford, my friend. You have no choice but to act." Leonardo rose from his seat, pacing toward the center of the room. His dark hair brushed against the high collar of his tunic as his anger simmered beneath the surface. The weight of their expectations infuriated him. The audacity to ask him to replace what could never be replaced. Yet duty, that merciless taskmaster, compelled him forward. He would go because he had to, though he refused to feign enthusiasm or hope. "Fine," he said at last, his voice low and chillingly calm, more menacing than any display of rage. "I shall attend your gathering. I will take my place on the throne. But hear this vow, old friend. I swear it now." He paused, lifting his chin as silver eyes gleamed with icy authority. "I will not accept another mate, not unless my ancient wolf, the part of me that has lain dormant since her passing, wakes. And not merely wakes, but bows to them." Timothy blanched, his ruddy complexion draining to ash. "Majesty, that is madness. A Lycan King's wolf does not bow. It is the primal alpha. Such a thing has never occurred in all our recorded history. It is impossible." "Precisely," Leonardo replied, his tone final. Without another word, he swept past his stunned beta, the hem of his black coat swirling around his boots as he strode from the room. He would sit upon his throne, endure the spectacle, and face the hopeful, fearful gazes of those who sought his favor. But he would do so secure in the knowledge that his unbreakable vow safeguarded both his grief and the memory of his first mate, preserving them in perfect, agonizing clarity. Rowena stood amidst the throng of unmated females, her body rigid with terror so profound it bordered on paralysis. The great hall loomed around her, vast and cavernous, its stone walls rising into shadowy heights above. Torches flickered along the edges of the space, casting uneven light onto rich tapestries that failed to soften the oppressive atmosphere. Hundreds of shifters filled the air with tension, their combined energy creating a suffocating weight. This was no celebration. It was a selection, a culling cloaked in pageantry. The process was clinical, devoid of warmth or joy. Females were paraded before the throne like offerings, each step measured and scrutinized. Rowena felt the eyes of the crowd pressing down on her, judging, evaluating. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to escape the suffocating judgment that awaited. But she remained rooted to the spot, trapped by tradition and expectation. As the moments dragged on, The enormity of the situation settled over her like a shroud. She glanced toward the dais where the king sat, his presence commanding even in stillness. His expression was unreadable, carved from ice and shadow. There was no softness in him, no hint of yielding. Rumors whispered of his refusal to choose a new mate, of vows made in defiance of custom. Whether true or not, the aura of finality surrounding him was undeniable. For Rowena, the ceremony was a gauntlet she had no choice but to endure. Each heartbeat seemed to echo through the chamber, amplifying her fear. Her mind raced, searching for some semblance of control in a situation designed to strip it away. Around her, others fidgeted or whispered prayers under their breath, while some wore masks of determination. Yet none appeared immune to the collective dread permeating the hall. When her turn came, Rowena stepped forward mechanically, her legs moving without conscious thought. The distance between her and the throne stretched endlessly, each step heavier than the last. As she approached, she forced herself to meet the king's gaze, though doing so felt like staring into the heart of a storm. His silver eyes bore into hers, cold and piercing, offering neither warmth nor mercy. In that moment, she understood why so many feared him and why so few dared to dream of standing beside him. She kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the worn leather slippers of the girl ahead, attempting to count the stitches in the seam. She tried to shrink herself, blending into the crowd of silk and wool, becoming just another shadow along the wall. But the line inched forward, a slow and unyielding procession, carrying them all toward the elevated platform at the front of the hall. Suddenly, the main doors at the far end, two massive slabs of iron-bound oak, burst open with a resounding crash that echoed through the room. A profound silence fell over the space, so abrupt and complete that Rowena felt her breath catch in her throat. The shuffling stopped. The nervous whispers faded. King Leonardo had entered. He didn't walk like an ordinary man. He moved like a shadow, a dark, fluid presence that seemed to drain warmth and light from the room as he passed. He was a ghost in his own throne room. Without sparing a glance at the assembly, he ascended the steps to the platform and settled into the massive carved chair, his expression one of absolute cold indifference. His silver eyes swept over the sea of hopeful, ambitious, and terrified women, yet they saw nothing. It was the gaze of a man staring into an empty grave. Lord Timothy stood at his right hand, his face a mask of strange formality, his eyes darting nervously around the room with an energy the king clearly did not share. The herald, a thin man whose hands trembled slightly, stepped forward and unrolled a long scroll. "Let the sacred mating ceremony begin," he announced, his voice cracking faintly. The process unfolded like a quiet, brutal torture, methodical and merciless. "Alexa of the Riverbend," the herald called, his voice wavering. A young girl stepped forward, trembling, her blonde hair braided with hopeful blue ribbons. She curtsied low, her entire body quaking. King Leonardo remained still, silent, unmoved. He didn't even truly look at her, Rowena thought, a fresh wave of nausea rising in her chest. His gaze was fixed somewhere above her head, lost in a memory only he could see. After an agonizing stretch of silence, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Relief washed over the girl's face, profound and undisguised, before she practically bolted from the platform. "Mariah of Stone Creek," the herald announced next. This girl approached with confidence bordering on arrogance, her chin held high. Her red dress stood out like a streak of fire against the muted tones of the hall. She was beautiful, and she knew it. Surely this would stir the silent king. Leonardo's gaze met hers, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Among shifters, the wolf within was said to sense its mate, awakening with a possessive, undeniable urge. But Leonardo's wolf remained utterly, insultingly silent. His expression stayed one of chilling boredom. With a lazy wave of his hand, a gesture dripping with disinterest, he dismissed her. Humiliation flushed her face crimson before she turned and stormed away. The ritual continued, each girl stepping forward with varying degrees of hope and fear, only to be met with the same icy indifference. Rowena watched as the king's detachment crushed one spirit after another, his silver eyes vacant, his presence both overwhelming and eerily absent. The weight of his silence pressed down on the room, suffocating and unrelenting. Lord Timothy shifted uncomfortably beside him, his nervous energy a stark contrast to the king's calm detachment. The herald's voice droned on, calling name after name, but the outcome never changed. The girls came and went, their dreams dashed against the unyielding stone of Leonardo's apathy. Rowena's heart pounded in her chest as she observed the scene, her mind racing with thoughts of what it must feel like to stand before such a man. Each dismissal seemed to echo louder than the last, reverberating through the hall like a death knell for hope itself. The air grew heavier with every passing moment, thick with unspoken tension and the collective despair of those who dared to dream of something more. Yet Leonardo remained untouched, a figure of cold authority, detached from the lives he so casually dismantled. His throne loomed above them all, a symbol of power and emptiness, a reminder of the chasm between ruler and subject. And still, the line moved forward, relentless and unforgiving. One by one, they approached the throne. A tall, statuesque woman from the north, dismissed. A shy, dark-haired girl of merchant descent, dismissed. Each stepped forward with hope flickering in their eyes, only to be met with the same cold indifference. The king was no seeker of companionship. He was an arbiter passing judgment. Rowena watched, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate for escape. This scene embodied her worst fears, the clinical scrutiny, the public display, and the unyielding authority radiating from the man seated on the throne. She recalled Chloe's shattered spirit, the emptiness that had dulled her once vivid gaze. Though this king might lack Sam's cruelty, his hollow detachment carried its own brand of dread. To be claimed by him would feel akin to being bound to lifelessness itself. The girl ahead of her, a trembling young woman named Cyrus, was dismissed without ceremony and hurried past, her face drained of color. Then there was nothing between Rowena and the dais but open space. Alone now at the foot of the platform, she instinctively took a step back, her heels striking the worn stone floor with a faint click. The herald paused mid-motion, scanning the now empty expanse before him. His eyes darted down to his scroll, then up again, confusion knitting his brow as he registered her hesitation. "Rowena of the lower valley," he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally loud in the vast hall. Rowena froze, every muscle locking into place as though weighted down by invisible chains. This was it, the moment she dreaded since childhood. Every eye in the cavernous chamber snapped toward her, hundreds of them converging on her solitary figure. The king's gaze rose slowly, deliberately, until it landed on her with alarming precision. It wasn't curiosity or interest that filled those eyes, it was something far more primal. Ancient and assessing, it pinned her where she stood, stripping away any semblance of protection she might have clung to. Her blood ran cold under the weight of that predatory stare. This was the moment when submission was demanded, when tradition dictated she curtsy low, offering herself up for judgment. This was the moment Chloe had been broken, her will crushed beneath the weight of a bond thrust upon her too soon. Rowena felt the crushing pressure of countless expectations pressing down on her shoulders, the silent mandate issued by the court demanding compliance. No, the word exploded silently within her mind, raw and defiant. It was a rejection not just of the king's claim, but of the very system that sought to define her fate. All her fears, all the horrors she'd borne witness to, all the sleepless nights spent dreading this exact second, crystallized into one overwhelming imperative. Run. Without curtsying, without speaking, without lowering her eyes even for a heartbeat, she turned and bolted. Pandemonium erupted behind her. A collective gasp swept through the great hall, sucking the air from the room like a tide abruptly pulled from shore. Shouts rang out, mingling with the metallic clatter of spears hitting stone, and the guttural scrape of the king's massive throne being shoved backward. "Seize her!" Lord Timothy bellowed, his voice shaking with disbelief and fury. "Lock the hall!" But Rowena was already gone. Small and swift, she moved with a terror so pure it seemed to lift her off the ground entirely. Her feet barely touched the polished marble as she darted past startled nobles and lunged through gaps in the crowd. The guards stationed near the doors hesitated, momentarily stunned by the unprecedented breach of protocol. By the time they recovered, she had slipped through their ranks, disappearing into the labyrinthian corridors beyond. Adrenaline surged through her veins, sharpening her senses and quickening her pace. The castle loomed around her, its grandeur transformed into a maze of shadows and echoing footsteps. Behind her, shouts echoed, growing fainter as distance widened between her and her pursuers. For now she was free, but freedom came at a cost yet unknown. She burst through a side door used by servants, her worn slippers sliding precariously on the slick stone floor. Behind her, a guard lunged, his gauntlet scraping against the wall where she had been just moments before. The sharp, metallic sound sent her panic soaring. She was deep within the fortress now, but it was not her home. She belonged to the lower valley, to open fields, cozy cottages, and familiar woods. This place was a sprawling stronghold of immense wealth and power, built for war and defense rather than comfort. To her, it felt like a cold, unyielding trap. Taking a left, her breath tearing at her lungs, she sprinted down a corridor lined with heavy tapestries. The woven figures seemed to watch her, their stitched eyes silently accusing. At the end of the hall, she faced a stone wall and two identical arched doorways. Choosing the right, she dashed into another passage, colder and darker, the air thick and suffocating. Heavy boots thundered behind her, amplified by the stone walls. They were closer now. "Seal the east wing!" a voice roared, distorted by the labyrinthine corridors. She ran toward what she hoped was the private quarter, though she had no idea where the east wing lay or what the private quarter meant. The fortress was an intricate maze designed to disorient intruders. Every turn looked identical, every archway's indistinguishable from the last. She felt like prey cornered in a hunter's snare, the walls pressing in as the sounds of pursuit echoed all around her. Rounding another corner, she skidded to a halt, her hands slamming into the icy granite to steady herself. Ahead, 3 guards stood at the far end of the corridor, their backs to her, clearly moving to block the exit she had been aiming for. They hadn't seen her yet. Rowena retreated quickly, her heart pounding as if it might explode. Her lungs burned, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She was utterly, terrifyingly lost. There was no way out. Leaning against the cold stone, gasping for air, her mind raced. She couldn't keep running. She was a rabbit caught in a den of wolves. Speed alone wouldn't save her. She needed to hide. Forcing herself to move more quietly, her footsteps now silent on the stone, she slipped into a narrow, shadowed passage she had overlooked earlier. This was no main thoroughfare. The air here was still, the stones darker and more imposing. It seemed like a private area, one where servants likely ventured only when summoned. Silence reigned, broken only by distant, muffled shouts that felt as though they came from another world entirely. She crept forward, every nerve taut. Along the walls hung portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes appearing to follow her in the dim light. At the end of the corridor stood a massive door carved with the intricate relief of a slumbering wolf. It was slightly ajar, offering a gap, a shadow, a hiding place. Without hesitation, she moved toward it. Hope was a fragile, reckless thing, but it was all she had left. She pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, praying it would grant her refuge. The room beyond was vast and shadowy, its grandeur muted by the faint light filtering through high windows. Ornate furnishings and relics spoke of immense wealth and history, but she had no time to marvel. Her focus was survival. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow, listening intently for any sign of pursuit. For now, she was hidden. And for now, that would have to be enough. She pushed her shoulder against the heavy wooden door, gritting her teeth as it swung open with a barely audible groan. The hinges, well-oiled and smooth, moved effortlessly despite the door's immense size. Built for a giant, it dwarfed her small frame. Slipping through the narrow gap, she pressed her full weight against the door to pull it shut, holding her breath until the latch clicked into place. The sound, soft yet definitive, echoed like a thunderclap in the sudden silence. Rowena froze, her ear pressed to the thick wood, her body tense and rigid. She waited for the pounding of boots, the shouts of discovery, or the door being wrenched open. But there was nothing. The pursuit had faded, its echoes swallowed by the labyrinthine halls she had fled. For now, she was safe. A single shuddering breath escaped her lips as she sagged against the door, her knees trembling with relief. She stood there in the darkness for a long moment, letting her racing heart slow and the burning in her lungs subside. She had done it. She had escaped the ceremony, evaded the guards. Gradually, her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she turned to survey the room she had chosen as her refuge. It wasn't a guest chamber or a study. It was something far grander, far more imposing. A cavernous space stretched out before her, bathed in the silver glow of moonlight streaming through a tall, unshuttered window. The room was dominated by an enormous, unlit hearth, large enough to roast an ox, and a bed so vast it seemed fit for a deity. Heavy, dark wood chairs, each large enough to seat 3 men, were draped with furs. The air was cold, emasculate, and overwhelmingly masculine. This was a room designed to project power, not comfort. And then there was the scent. It wasn't the familiar musk of the pack guards or the shifters from the valley. This was something else entirely. Primal, instinctual, and unmistakable. It carried the sharp tang of cold mountain stone, the weight of ancient authority, the wildness of storms, and the raw lupine essence of dominance. It spoke of ownership, of territory claimed and unquestioned. A creeping dread, colder than her earlier fear, slithered up her spine. Her gaze fell on a silver-backed brush lying on a heavy dresser, its bristles pristine. Beside it rested a folded black tunic identical to the one the king had worn during the ceremony. This was his room, the king's private chamber. Rowena's blood turned to ice. She had fled from him in the hall, only to trap herself in the very place he was certain to return. Like a mouse hiding in the hawk's nest, she had sealed her own doom. The irony of it hit her like a physical blow, igniting a fresh wave of panic. She had to leave, now. Lunging away from the door, she grabbed the cold iron latch, her terror renewed. She would take her chances back in the maze-like halls, face the guards, anyone but him. She stilled suddenly, her hand gripping the metal, her body frozen. Footsteps. They were outside in the private hall, not the hurried clatter of guards or the chaos of a patrol, but the deliberate, singular tread of someone who owned the space. Rowena прижалась к стене, ее рука метнулась к рту, чтобы заглушить прерывистое дыхание. Шаги не прошли мимо, они остановились прямо за дверью.
Король Леонардо не знал имени девушки, и ему было все равно. Он лишь понимал, что впервые за всю историю своего рода женщина, представленная на церемонии спаривания, не только была отвергнута его дремлющим волком, но и имела наглость бежать из его присутствия до официального отбытия. Это был публичный оскорбительный акт, пощечина его авторитету и священному обряду, личное оскорбление его королевской власти. Его ярость превратилась в холодный, острый клинок в груди, приятную замену тупой, холодной глыбе горя, которую он обычно носил внутри. Он позволил своему бета-самцу справиться с хаосом в зале, с криками и паникой. Ему самому нужна была тишина своих покоев, чтобы новая чистая ярость выгорела дотла. Он шел быстрыми шагами по частным коридорам, его длинные тяжелые шаги пожирали каменный пол. Его сапоги были бесшумны, но его присутствие напоминало надвигающуюся грозу, отчего немногие слуги, мимо которых он проходил, прижимались к гобеленам, опустив головы и широко раскрыв глаза от страха. Он игнорировал их. Они были насекомыми, не имеющими значения. Его мысли были заняты девушкой, бледной, испуганной маленькой фигуркой, которая осмелилась посмотреть ему в глаза и затем убежать. Это было не отвержение его самого, его волк не проснулся, поэтому не было связи, которую можно было бы отвергнуть. Это было отвержение его права судить. Он повернул в свой личный коридор, последнее убежище. Стражи у входа, его элитные воины, увидев выражение его лица, моментально встали по стойке смирно, положив руки на рукояти мечей, устремив взгляды на противоположную каменную стену. Они знали, что лучше не говорить. Он предвкушал тишину своей комнаты, прохладный воздух, знакомый запах своей территории. Он собирался налить себе выпить, встать у окна и позволить очищающему пламени гнева пройти сквозь него. Он дошел до конца коридора, подняв руку к массивной резной двери, и остановился. Его рука замерла, зависнув в нескольких сантиметрах от дерева. Его покои не были пусты, он мог это почувствовать. Под знакомым запахом старого дерева, кожи и собственного мускуса чувствовалось что-то еще.
Это было слабо, скрыто под остаточным влиянием его собственной территории, но, несомненно, чужое. Запах женщины и запах страха. Острый, медный привкус, который щекотал его чувства. Кто-то был в его комнате, нарушитель. Его холодный, точный гнев мгновенно испарился, уступив место более первобытной, территориальной ярости. То, что кто-то в этой крепости посмел вторгнуться в его святилище, его собственное логово, было нарушением, требующим немедленного, жестокого исправления. Он больше не был униженным королем. Он стал верховным хищником, чья берлога была нарушена. As his hand grasped the iron latch, it struck without warning. Deep within him, beneath layers of dormant rage, something ancient stirred. The wolf that had lain lifeless for 2 seasons, a silent corpse buried under grief and solitude, erupted with ferocious intensity. It wasn't a gentle awakening or a tentative flicker of life. It was a violent, shattering force, a surge of raw possession that tore through his body like lightning. The air left his lungs instant, and the sheer primal power of it nearly dropped him to the ground. This was no ordinary resurgence. It was a deafening declaration, a roar that demanded recognition. Leonardo's human consciousness reeled under the onslaught. The shock of this sudden awakening hit him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless and disoriented. The beast inside clawed at his chest, howling a single word over and over. Mine, mine, mine. His rational mind was obliterated, consumed by a torrent of instinct he believed had died alongside his first mate. Something in the room had awakened that ancient part of him, something his bloodline now demanded he claim with unrelenting urgency. The latch in his hand became irrelevant, his grip reflexive rather than purposeful. His left hand shot forward, slamming into the door with enough force to splinter the wood. Claws he hadn't felt in months ripped free, slicing through the air and carving deep gouges into the oak. He didn't simply open the door, he hurled it aside as if it were nothing more than a barrier standing between him and what he sought. The heavy slab of wood crashed inward, smashing against the stone wall with a thunderous impact that reverberated through the entire wing. Dust rained down from the frame, swirling in the dim light. And there she was. She stood pressed against the far wall near his dresser, her hand hovering near her mouth. It was the girl, the pale, trembling figure who had fled the great hall earlier. Her eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. They weren't human eyes anymore. They belonged to prey, caught in the sights of a predator. Pure, unfiltered fear radiated from her, thick enough to scent in the air. She was frozen, unable to move, like a rabbit paralyzed beneath the shadow of a hawk. His human mind, fragmented and overwhelmed, struggled to comprehend. This fragile, frightened creature? This was what had awakened the beast? This was what his wolf was screaming to claim? Rowena saw only darkness and rage filling the doorway. He was no longer the cold, detached king from the throne room. This was something far more terrifying, a monster. His claws gleamed menacingly, and his silver eyes burned with an unnatural molten fire. In that moment, she understood. This was death itself. She had fled the ceremony only to seal her fate, trapping herself alone with the very embodiment of destruction. He stepped into the room, each movement deliberate and suffocating. Power rolled off him in waves, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. There was no doubt in her mind he intended to kill her. He intended to tear her apart for her audacity, for daring to intrude. And then everything froze. Leonardo's mind raced with unanswered questions, his anger at her disrespect clashing with an ancient, primal instinct that surged within him. But the wolf inside him had no questions, no tolerance for human grievances. It saw only what was in front of it, her. The proud, untamed beast that had governed his lineage for centuries, the wolf that had never bent to any alpha or ruler, did something unimaginable. There was no choice, no conscious thought, only an overwhelming compulsion that overtook him completely. A force stronger than his own will crashed into him from deep within. His knees gave out, his spine arched, and his head dropped, chin pressed to his chest. His wolf, the essence of his very soul, bowed to her. It was the ultimate act of primal submission. The impossible vow he had sworn to Timothy, the one meant to ensure he would never claim another, had been fulfilled. Shock consumed him. His mind went blank, a void of silence. He was horrified, enraged. Yet beneath those emotions stirred something else, a terrifying sense of completion, undeniable and immediate, awakening a part of him he thought long dead. When he finally raised his head, the bow complete, his eyes were no longer silver, but blazed like molten gold. The wolf now ruled absolutely. Rowena watched, her thoughts struggling to make sense of what she saw. The monstrous figure who had burst into the room, brimming with claws and fury, suddenly faltered. He lowered his head in an act of profound submission, so unexpected that her terror momentarily dissolved. She didn't grasp its meaning, nor did she understand the significance of his vow or the intricate dynamics of a Lycan King's wolf. All she knew was that the man who moments ago seemed ready to kill her now stared at her with eyes burning like twin golden suns. Gone was the rage, replaced by something far more unsettling, a raw, possessive hunger that locked onto her with unrelenting focus. Leonardo's humanity had vanished, drowned beneath the weight of instinct. The bow had sealed the final piece, and his impossible vow had unlocked the chains holding him back. Grief, once a cold anchor weighing him down for 2 seasons, evaporated under the heat of a new consuming fire. Thought ceased to exist. There was no king, no widower lost in sorrow. Only the wolf remained, and the wolf had been given permission. Mine. Claim now. He moved, not stalking, not walking, but crossing the moonlit expanse in 2 fluid bounds, his speed supernatural. Rowena had no time to scream, no chance to even register his movement before he reached her. With crushing force, he slammed her against the stone wall, driving the air from her lungs. Pinned, her feet barely grazing the floor, she hung suspended by the sheer power of his presence. This was it. The nightmare, the cage, the invasion. It was happening. She tried to scream, but his hand swiftly covered her mouth, silencing her with an unyielding finality. His golden eyes bore into hers, and in their depths, she saw no trace of humanity, only the raw, primal instinct of an ancient force on the verge of consummation. He leaned closer, his dark hair grazing her cheek as he inhaled deeply at the crook of her neck. The shuddering breath reverberated through her entire being. Then his teeth grazed her skin, sending a jolt of panic coursing through her veins. She thrashed against him, her struggles frantic yet futile. He was immovable, a solid, unyielding mass. Without hesitation, he sank his fangs into the tender flesh where her neck met her shoulder. It wasn't an act of cruelty or aggression. It was possession, a claiming. A searing, white-hot pain shot through her, so intense it blinded her momentarily. But the pain quickly gave way to something far more overwhelming, a surge of alien power flooding her veins. It hit her like lightning, consuming her entirely. It was him, his essence, his wolf, his ancient strength, invading her system, seeking out her own fragile, terrified wolf and binding it irrevocably to him. The sensation was suffocating. She felt the bond snap into place, the blessing she had dreaded. It wasn't a lifeline or a connection. It was a chain, an iron collar locking her to him. She was no longer her own. The sheer magnitude of the bond rocked him back as well. He gasped against her skin, his senses overwhelmed. For so long he had been a ghost, numb and cold, adrift in a sea of grief. Now his entire being burned with life. He could feel her terror, her racing pulse, her very soul now inextricably linked to his. It was too much, a sensory overload that left him stunned. Momentarily lost, his head still bent to her neck, he struggled to process the sudden, violent return to life. Rowena was pinned against the wall, trapped, her worst nightmare unfolding in the span of a single agonizing heartbeat. Time seemed to stretch, suspended in a terrible ringing silence. The only sounds were his harsh, shuddering breaths against her skin and the frantic hammering of her own heart. Leonardo was engulfed by the sudden flood of sensation. The bond was a torrent, a rushing river of life where there had once been only barren emptiness. He could feel her, and the dominant emotion radiating from her was terror, a bitter, sharp taste in his mouth, clashing discordantly with the primal triumph of the claim. He had anticipated completion, but not this shared, agonizing panic. Rowena's world had narrowed to two things, the crushing weight of his body and the throbbing mark on her neck. The initial pain was fading, replaced by the oppressive weight of the bond. She could feel him, not just his physical presence, but his mind, his power, his ancient strength, his wolf. It was inside her head, an alien entity settling over her consciousness, demanding submission. The presence was heavy, dark, and unrelenting, pressing against her own will, forcing her to yield. It was both foreign and invasive, a force she could neither escape nor resist. Her sense of self wavered under its weight, threatening to drown her completely. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with the intensity of what had just transpired. Every movement, every breath felt magnified, charged with an energy that neither of them could escape. Rowena's thoughts raced, fragmented and chaotic, as she grappled with the enormity of what had been forced upon her. She wanted to push him away, to break free, but the bond held her firmly in place, an invisible tether binding her to him. For Leonardo, the experience was no less tumultuous. The rush of sensation was intoxicating, yet disorienting. He had spent years numb, disconnected, but now he was hyper-aware of everything, her fear, her resistance, the fragile thread of life that connected them. It was both exhilarating and unbearable, a paradox he wasn't prepared for. He had claimed her, marked her as his own, but the reality of the bond was far more complex than he had imagined. It wasn't just a joining of souls. It was a collision of wills, a battle for dominance that neither of them had fully consented to. As the moments passed, the initial shock began to ebb, leaving behind a tense, electric stillness. Rowena's breathing slowed, though her heart continued to race. She could feel him retreating slightly, his grip loosening as he processed the enormity of what had just occurred. But the bond remained, a constant reminder of the irreversible change that had taken place. Leonardo lifted his head, his golden eyes meeting hers once more. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, regret, perhaps, or uncertainty, but it was quickly overshadowed by the primal satisfaction of the claim. He had done what he set out to do, but the cost was written plainly on her face. Rowena stared back at him, her expression a mixture of defiance and resignation. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break, not completely. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Neither of them moved, neither spoke. The bond pulsed between them, a living, breathing thing that neither could ignore. It was a beginning, but it felt more like an ending, a closing of one chapter and the reluctant opening of another. Whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by a force neither fully understood nor could escape. It was an enveloping warmth, thick and unyielding, whispering to her in a voice that brooked no argument. "Stay. You are safe. You belong to me." This was the moment everything inside Chloe shattered. The instant her will crumbled, leaving behind only emptiness, a vacant shell where her spirit had once been. Rowena felt the weight of it pressing down on her, trying to soothe, trying to reshape her into something compliant. Her survival instincts, sharpened by years of living in fear, screamed louder than the bond binding her, louder than the commanding dominance urging her stillness. She couldn't fight him. He was immovable, a wall of muscle and raw power. Pushing against him would be futile, screaming useless. But with the clarity of prey backed into a corner, she saw it, his vulnerability. For one fleeting second, he was lost, overwhelmed by the very connection he had forced upon her. His grip, so firm just moments ago, faltered. His focus wavered as his senses reeled from the shock of their bond. He was exposed. She didn't fight or push. Instead, her survival instinct whispered another truth: flee. As he stood there, momentarily consumed by the intensity of their link, she moved. Her head turned slightly, lips brushing against the dark strands near his ear. 2 fragile, breathless words escaped her mouth. "Oh no." And then she acted, not with force, but precision. Small and nimble, she collapsed her legs beneath her, letting her body go limp like water slipping through fingers. In that brief moment of imbalance, she slid out from under his arm. His hand closed around nothing but air as a grunt of surprise escaped him. That single heartbeat of disarray gave her freedom. Rowena scrambled across the floor, her slippers finding traction on the smooth stone surface. Panic surged in her chest as she sprinted toward the massive open doorway, the only path to escape. She didn't glance back. The sound of her own ragged breathing filled her ears as she burst through the threshold and fled into the private hall. Leonardo, still reeling from the aftershock of their bond, processed what was happening a fraction too late. His head snapped up and a guttural roar tore from his throat, a primal cry of disbelief and fury. Rowena was running away from him. The concept refused to register in his mind. She was his. He had claimed her. His mark branded her skin. His presence invaded her thoughts. By every law ingrained in his nature, she should have stayed close, sought his protection, submitted to his authority. Yet here she was, fleeing as though pursued by death itself. His wolf, which had howled in triumph mere seconds ago, now let out a keening wail of anguish and confusion. It clawed at his insides, demanding answers, demanding action. Leonardo lurched forward, driven by instinct, but as she ran farther, the bond between them stretched painfully taut. A living thread of psychic energy connected them, pulsing erratically as it strained against its limits. It wasn't designed for this kind of distance, not so soon after its violent inception. Bonds like theirs were meant to strengthen with closeness, with acceptance, with trust. But Rowena's flight tore at it, pulling it thin and brittle. Rowena disappeared down the corridor, a blur of pale fabric vanishing into shadows. Leonardo stumbled after her, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Triumph warred with rejection, possession battled bewilderment. Every step he took seemed to stretch the bond further, making it scream within him. It was both a tether and a torment, yanking at his consciousness while refusing to snap entirely. How could she run? How could she deny what they were to each other? Logic failed him. Reason unraveled under the primal need to chase, to reclaim, to possess. But even as his body obeyed the command to pursue, doubt flickered at the edges of his rage. Something about her reaction unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. This wasn't defiance born of strength. It was terror rooted in survival. And yet, despite knowing this, he couldn't stop himself. His mate had rejected him, and his wolf couldn't comprehend why. Her frantic escape pulled at it with such force that it stretched to its limits and began to fracture. Leonardo let out a roar, clutching his chest as an unbearable pain tore through him. The sensation was not just physical, but something far more profound, a psychic rending of his very soul. It wasn't the dull throb of sorrow. It was a searing, white-hot agony that left him reeling. Stumbling, he slammed his shoulder into the stone wall of the corridor, his vision blurring as the world around him turned gray for a fleeting moment. Through the haze of torment, he emerged into the private hall, claws extended, teeth bared in raw anguish. At the far end of the long passageway, he caught sight of her, a small, desperate figure vanishing around a corner. At that same instant, Lord Timothy and 6 royal guards arrived at the opposite end of the hall, drawn by the king's thunderous roar. They skidded to a halt, frozen in shock as they took in the scene before them. There stood their king, disheveled, his tunic torn at the collar, eyes blazing with the golden fire of the wolf. His claws were unsheathed, wild desperation etched across his face. Deep gouges marred the door to his chambers, evidence of violence still fresh in the air. The corridor itself seemed heavy with the primal scent of what had transpired. A brutal claiming now shattered. And then there was the girl, fleeing from him, disappearing into the distance. The humiliation hit him like a physical blow, colder and sharper than any grief he'd ever known. More painful even than the splintered bond or the fading claim of his mate running through his own fortress under the watchful eyes of his men. This public unraveling stripped away the last vestiges of his human restraint. Throwing his head back, Leonardo unleashed a sound no longer belonging to man alone. It was the roar of the Lycan King, an ancient, terrifying cry amplified by the cold stone walls. a sound brimming with both agony and absolute authority. "Lock down," he commanded, his voice cracking under barely contained rage. "Seal the gates. Seal every door. Find her." His words sliced through the air like a blade. "No one gets out." As if in answer, the deep, resonant alarms of the fortress began to blare, a cacophony of panic echoing from the high towers to the deepest foundations. The entire stronghold became a prison, its doors slamming shut, trapping everyone inside. Rowena was ensnared within its walls, and the king, broken, enraged, and publicly humiliated, began the hunt. The command reverberated through the corridors with palpable force. The guards stationed nearby flinched but wasted no time obeying. Trained to follow their king's orders without question, they sprang into action. Boots pounded against the stone floors as voices bellowed commands, relaying the king's fury throughout the fortress. "Lock down by the king's command, seal the gates, man the walls." Leonardo remained where he was, leaning heavily against the wall, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. The pain coursing through him was indescribable, a jagged void where the bond once existed, a psychic amputation leaving him hollow. Every inhalation felt like another tearing of the wound, reopening the spiritual gash anew. Yet, as excruciating as the pain was, it paled in comparison to the shame burning within him. His men had witnessed it all, the unraveling of their king, exposed and vulnerable in ways never seen before. Timothy, his lifelong friend and beta, had witnessed it all. The Lycan King, the ultimate predator of his lineage, had been left humiliated by a small, pale woman whose name he didn't even know. The shame burned cold, yet seared hotter than the torment of the bond itself. The fortress alarms, silent for decades, roared to life. It wasn't a bell, but a deep, resonating horn, a sound reserved for war, for invasion, for an assault on the keep. Its vibrations coursed through every stone, ensuring every shifter, guard, and servant was now on edge, hearts pounding with fear. Rowena. Her name whispered through the fractured bond, etched into him like a curse. Pushing off the wall, his body stiffened with icy fury. The wolf remained in control, but its initial shock had been consumed by the predator's singular focus: to hunt, to reclaim what was stolen, to reassert dominance. The distant crash of the main portcullis reverberated through the mountain. The massive iron gates, weighted by tons of stone, slammed shut. The fortress was sealed. Every gate, every door. No one entered and no one escaped. Timothy approached, his face pale, his expression a mix of confusion and profound disbelief. "Leonardo, Your Majesty, what has happened? Who was she?" Leonardo turned his burning golden gaze on his beta. "She is mine," he snarled, the words guttural and final. "And she is in my fortress." Without waiting for a response, he moved past Timothy, ignoring the raw tear in his chest. The pain was no longer a weakness. It was a beacon, a tether. He could feel her, a frantic, terrified pulse of light in the darkness, a heartbeat that wasn't his own. "Split the patrols," he commanded over his shoulder, his voice low and menacing, carrying down the hall. "I want her found. I want her brought to me unharmed." The last word was a threat, a promise of consequences for failure. Yet he didn't join the search parties. Instead, he moved into the shadows. They could search, but they lacked what he possessed: the bond. He felt the echo of her terror, intertwined with his own agony. Letting the pain guide him, he followed it like a raw, open wound leading to its source. Ignoring Timothy, he launched himself down the corridor, moving with terrifying speed, silent and precise. He didn't need sight or sound. He could feel her. Timothy stood frozen in the corridor, the king's feral roar still ringing in his ears. He watched as Leonardo vanished into the shadows, a primal hunter driven by instinct alone. The alarms blared, guards rushed past, their expressions grim and confused. As Beta, he should have taken command, but the weight of the moment paralyzed him. Resentment simmered beneath his shock. How had this unnamed woman unraveled the king so completely? How had she managed to breach the fortress, to spark such chaos? The questions churned, but answers eluded him. All he knew was that the balance of power had shifted, and the consequences would ripple far beyond this night. "Move out," he roared, his voice sharp and commanding, honed by 2 years of unyielding authority. "Captain, take your team to the lower levels. Seal off the old servant passages, now. She's small, defenseless, and frightened." The guards scattered, their relief at having clear orders evident amid the chaos. But Timothy's thoughts were far from the hunt. His mind replayed the scene that had just unfolded. He claimed her, not a noblewoman, not a political alliance, but a fragile, nameless girl who had fled the ceremony in terror. And Leonardo, the so-called Ghost King, had reacted in a way that still burned in Timothy's memory. Even from across the hall, he had seen it, the impossible, submissive gesture. Then she had run. A bitter smile flickered across Timothy's face, hidden as he turned away. Weak. The king, who had been a hollow shell of grief for 2 seasons, was now driven by instincts he couldn't control. Resentment churned in Timothy's chest, sharp and acidic. It was fresh. Only 3 moons prior, he had brought a border dispute before Leonardo. The Stone Creek Pack, a minor clan, had encroached on his ancestral lands, a clear violation of Alpha Law. He had expected Leonardo to side with him, to punish the trespassers and assert dominance. Instead, Leonardo, ever the cold arbiter, had studied the ancient maps and declared the land contested, ruling in favor of shared hunting grounds. Fairness over loyalty. Humiliation over allegiance. Timothy had served Leonardo faithfully, managing the kingdom while the king drowned in his grief. He had borne the silence, the apathy, the shadow of leadership. And this was his reward? Public disgrace. Now the king was humiliated. Now the king was feral. Now the king had a fragile, terrified mate, one who had fled. This was an opportunity, a chance to seize control, to show the court who the true leader was. "My lord," the captain asked, returning, "your orders?" Timothy's expression hardened, his features settling into a mask of dutiful concern. He was the Beta. He knew this fortress better than anyone. He knew its secrets, the hidden paths, the forgotten tunnels, the rooms lost to time. While Leonardo hunted with raw, instinctual fury, Timothy would hunt with strategy. "I'll coordinate from the West Tower," he said smoothly, lying without hesitation. "But first, I'll check the old cellar passages myself." She looked terrified. "She'll seek somewhere deep below ground to hide," the captain nodded. "A wise decision, my lord." Timothy turned and walked, not ran, toward the stairs leading down. He wouldn't find her for the king. He would find her for himself. If he reached her first, he could save her. He could turn her against the feral king. He could shelter her. He could break her. And in doing so, he would shatter the man who had wronged him. The fortress buzzed with chaos. Alarms screamed, men shouted, boots pounded against stone, but none of it reached Leonardo's ears. He moved through a different realm, one defined by raw sensation. The only sound he registered was the frantic rhythm of a terrified heartbeat. Rowena's. Her name cut through him like a jagged blade, sharp and painful. Their bond, now fractured, felt like an open wound in his chest, yet it also served as an unbreakable tether. It guided him through the labyrinth of what had once been his home, now alien and hostile. With inhuman speed, he bypassed the main stairs, leaping over a balcony to drop 20 feet onto the marble below. His landing cracked the stone beneath him, but he rose instantly, a shadow flowing silently through the disorder he had unleashed. He was no longer man but wolf, driven purely by instinct. His humanity locked away, caged by the beast within. All traces of his apathy, detachment, and grief were consumed by this singular purpose: find her, retrieve her, heal her. He had to reach Rowena, hold her still until their connection mended. Her terror burned through him like acid in his veins, an unbearable torment. Her flight stung like an affront, while her fear poisoned the bond between them, amplifying the agony in his chest exponentially. "Your Majesty!" a guard's voice broke through briefly, but Leonardo responded with a snarl so feral it sent the man recoiling into the wall, bowing his head in submission. The king paid no heed. He followed the pull of the tether. She was near, somewhere deep in the lower levels of the fortress. Bursting into the servants' quarters, he entered a maze of low-ceiling tunnels. The air here was thick and stale, oppressive. Yet scent wasn't guiding him now. It was her terror that drew him, a beacon calling out to his primal instincts. Suddenly, the tether yanked sharply left. She'd changed direction again, running still. He could feel her adrenaline spiking, her desperate heartbeat pounding as though it were his own. Without hesitation, he crashed through a heavy wooden door, splintering its frame, moving like a force of nature, tearing through his own domain. The king was gone, replaced entirely by the predator. 2 drives propelled him forward, the possessive need to reclaim what belonged to him, and the visceral desperation to end the pain ripping through him. Only by marking her again, forcing her to submit, holding her until she accepted him, could the agony cease. He sensed her clearly now, panicked, disoriented, fleeing deeper into the fortress, toward abandoned sections long forgotten. A darker anger surged within him. She wasn't merely running, she was hiding from him. As he rounded another corner, claws raked into the stone wall, gouging out chunks of granite. She was close, too close. The connection screamed in his mind, a sharp, unrelenting noise that clawed at his thoughts. While King Leonardo tore through his fortress with primal desperation, driven by an instinct both raw and agonizing, Lord Timothy moved with calculated precision. He was not hunting, he was trapping. The chaos above, shouts echoing, crates being overturned, guards scrambling, was irrelevant to him. He let them follow the king's thunderous roars that reverberated from the upper levels, their efforts futile, their focus scattered. Instead, he descended into the wine cellars, where the air grew cool and heavy with stillness. Timothy walked past rows of dusty barrels until he reached a section of the wall indistinguishable from the rest. Pressing his hand against it, a hidden latch clicked, revealing a narrow doorway cloaked in shadow. Beyond it lay stone steps spiraling downward into darkness. This fortress was his domain. Born within these walls, he had explored its secrets as a child long before Leonardo ever wore the crown. He knew every hidden passage, every forgotten tunnel, every dead-end artery. While Leonardo raged like wildfire, Timothy moved like a creeping shadow, silent, deliberate, and deadly. His boots made no sound on the damp stone as he descended deeper into the mountain's core. The distant alarms throbbed faintly, almost imperceptible now. Here, surrounded by cold stone and ancient silence, his mind sharpened. Leonardo was unraveling. Leonardo was unraveling. The king who prided himself on icy logic and detached judgment had been undone by fear, for a child, no less. The same man who had humiliated Timothy in open court was now humiliating himself before his entire guard, roaring like a caged beast. Each splintered door, each frenzied shout proved what Timothy already knew. Leonardo was unfit. His leash had slipped, handed over unwittingly to a terrified girl. And Timothy understood exactly where a frightened creature would flee, not toward light or safety, but down, deep into the dark, into the earth, into places where she could burrow and disappear. The main patrol searched living quarters, kitchens, armories, all useless endeavors. They wouldn't find her there. Leonardo, meanwhile, followed the pull of the bond, a force Timothy understood all too well. It was powerful, yes, a beacon fueled by raw emotion, but it was also loud, chaotic, dictating movements based on panic rather than reason. Leonardo would crash through walls, blind to strategy, led only by instinct. Timothy, however, relied on something far more reliable: knowledge. These tunnels were etched into his memory, connecting the cellars to abandoned dungeons and, beyond them, to the cisterns. He could anticipate her path, predict her choices. A grim satisfaction settled over him. He would reach her first. Not as a servant of the king, but as a savior. When he stepped out of the shadows, calm and composed, he would offer her protection. He would paint Leonardo as a madman, feral, unhinged, dangerous. In her terror, she would believe him. She would trust him because he would seem reasonable, steady, safe. And once she did, he would take her. He would hide her somewhere even the bond couldn't touch, a sanctuary shielded by layers of stone and old wards. There he would hold her, the key to Leonardo's stability, firmly in his grasp. He stood at the intersection of two tunnels, listening intently. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint, rhythmic drip of water echoing in the distance. A smile crept across his face. He had outpaced her. Now all he needed to do was wait. Rowena ran until her body felt like it might collapse beneath her. Her lungs burned as if filled with acid, and her legs were numb, barely functioning limbs that stumbled over themselves. The alarms blared around her, an unrelenting shriek that seemed to emanate from the very walls, vibrating through her teeth. It wasn't just noise. It was the sound of her world unraveling. But worse than the alarms was the roar. It wasn't merely heard. It was felt, a deep, concussive force reverberating in her chest and rattling her bones. It belonged to him, the king, and it carried such raw, feral fury that it struck her like a physical blow. Each time she heard it, the mark on her neck pulsed painfully, a searing reminder of what he had done to her. The bond, that monstrous thing inside her. It wasn't a connection, it was an invasion, a suffocating parasite lodged in her mind. Through it, she could feel him, his rage, his agony, his possessive need. His emotions flooded her consciousness, threatening to drown her own thoughts. He was hunting her, using this vile link to track her every move. She was utterly lost. After fleeing the private hall, she had descended the first staircase she found, desperate for darkness, for lower ground. Now she wandered aimlessly through a labyrinth of cold, damp stone, somewhere deep within the fortress's foundations. She stumbled into a vast, shadowy chamber, thick with the smell of dust and decay. Pressing herself against a pillar, she tried to steady her trembling body. Silent sobs racked her throat as realization dawned. She had escaped one cage, only to find herself trapped in another. There was no way out. The main gate had slammed shut with finality, and every door would be sealed, every corridor guarded. Thump, thump, thump. Her heart pounded in her ears, but it wasn't just her pulse she felt. The bond between them crackled like a live wire, growing tauter as he drew closer. His presence loomed larger, heavier, suffocating. She was prey, and he was the predator circling above, knowing exactly where she hid. Staying there meant certain capture. Pushing off the pillar, she forced herself to run again, plunging deeper into the oppressive darkness. Empty cells lined her path, their iron doors rusted open, remnants of a forgotten dungeon steeped in despair. She burst through an archway into yet another tunnel, her foot slipping on the slick stone floor. Pain shot up her leg as her knee hit the ground hard. A small, weak cry escaped her lips. Ignoring the ache, she scrambled to her feet and limped onward, searching for any refuge he might not find. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. Rowena screamed, a thin, fragile sound, and stumbled backward, throwing her hands up instinctively to shield herself. But it wasn't the king. It wasn't the fiery golden eyes or the sharp claws that caught her attention. Instead, it was a tall, broad-shouldered man clad in fine leather garments of the king's court. He wasn't growling, but stood with his hands raised, his expression calm yet deeply concerned. This was Lord Timothy, the king's trusted beta. His gaze wasn't filled with anger, but pity as he spoke to her in a low, steady voice. "Hush, child," he said, his tone a soothing rumble. "You are safe. I will not let him harm you." Rowena stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. Lord Timothy, the king's oldest friend and confidant, stood before her, not as a predator, but as a steadying presence amid her chaos. He exuded calmness, his open hands signaling no threat. Unlike the monstrous figure who had claimed her or the shouting guards, he seemed, for now, like a beacon of hope. His deep voice cut through the shrill alarms still faintly echoing from above. Her terror was paralyzing, her mind fractured by the bond in her desperate flight. All she could do was tremble as she met his gaze. "I will not let him hurt you," he repeated, his sincerity unwavering. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step toward her, his movements measured and non-threatening. "You must come with me now. We don't have much time." A thunderous crash reverberated from the upper floors, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. The sound of splintering wood and raw, unrestrained force filled the air. "Leonardo!" Rowena flinched, a tiny whimper escaping her lips. The mark on her neck pulsed painfully, a searing spike of shared rage that wasn't hers. It belonged to him. She felt his fury, an overwhelming tide that threatened to drown her. Lord Timothy noticed her reaction, his eyes narrowing slightly, his pity calculated. "That sound," he murmured softly, as if addressing a frightened creature, "is not your king, not anymore." I am loyal to Leonardo, but the man up there, the bond has shattered his mind. He is feral. He is no longer himself." His words struck a chord, unlocking something within her. It all made a terrible kind of sense. The cold, hollow king seated upon the throne, the wild-eyed beast who had claimed her, and the raging monster tearing apart the fortress, they were not one and the same. Of course, the bond had broken him. It explained the alien rage coursing through the psychic link, a fury so foreign, so inhuman. It confirmed her worst fears. The bond wasn't a blessing, but a descent into madness. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why are you helping me?" Timothy hesitated, his jaw tightening imperceptibly before he responded. "My first duty is to the kingdom, and that feral beast is a danger to it, and to you. He is not in his right mind. There is no reasoning with him. He must be contained. And you, child," his voice hardened with conviction, though it rang false to her ears, "you are the source of his madness. He will stop at nothing to possess you. In his current state, he will destroy you." The weight of his words crashed over her, resonating with the haunting memory of Chloe's agonized cries. Something inside Rowena finally shattered completely. A sob escaped her lips as she realized she was trapped in a fortress with a mad king hunting her. "I will help you," Timothy said firmly, his voice filled with authority. "There's a way out, but you must trust me completely. We need to leave now before he finds us." He extended his hand, a strong, steady human hand. It wasn't the clawed hand that had pinned her to the wall. It was a hand of rescue. Another roar shook the stones around them, closer this time. Leonardo was somewhere above, his fury pressing down like a physical force. "Now, Rowena," Timothy urged sharply. She hesitated, glancing at the dark tunnel behind her, the one leading back to him, and then at the firm hand offered before her. Trapped, injured, and terrified, she had no choice. She took his hand. The moment her trembling fingers touched his, Lord Timothy's grip was firm and supportive. He pulled her to her feet, but as her weight shifted onto her injured knee, sharp pain shot up her leg, and she cried out. "I hurt my knee," she whimpered, her fragile hope teetering on the edge of collapse. She couldn't run or even walk properly. "I will help you. Lean on me," he commanded, leaving no room for argument. Without hesitation, he positioned himself under her arm, pulling it over his broad shoulders while wrapping his other arm securely around her waist, taking most of her weight. His strength was unwavering, and she clung to him, overwhelmed by the relief of not being alone anymore. For a brief moment, her fear subsided. "We must move quickly," he whispered urgently. "His senses are heightened." "He'll track you by scent, by the bond." Rowena's trembling voice broke through the tension. "The bond." She pressed a hand to her neck where the mark burned like hot coal. "It hurts. I can feel him." "I know," Timothy murmured sympathetically, guiding her away, not toward the main fortress, but deeper into shadowed passageways. "What he did, claiming you in such a feral state, it wasn't a true mating. It was an assault. It fractured the bond. That's why he's mad and why you're in so much pain. He isn't your mate, child. He is your cage." His words brought a grim comfort. Someone finally understood. Someone spoke the truth she'd always known. The bond was not a connection. It was imprisonment. A surge of desperate strength coursed through her. She trusted him. She had to. They moved through the darkness, Rowena limping heavily, nearly all her weight supported by Timothy. The alarms grew distant here, the roars of the king muffled but still palpable, their angry vibrations pulsing through the broken link between them. "Where are you taking me?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. "Out," he replied, the word carrying the weight of a promise. "The main gates are sealed, guards are everywhere, following the king's orders. In his current state, they won't distinguish between rescuing you and capturing you. They'll take you back to him. We cannot let that happen." Timothy continued to guide her carefully, each step deliberate despite the urgency. Rowena focused on putting one foot in front of the other, clinging to his steady presence. Though every movement sent waves of agony through her body, she pushed forward, driven by the hope he inspired. As they ventured further into the labyrinthine passages, the air grew colder, heavier. Shadows loomed like silent witnesses to their escape. Yet, amidst the suffocating darkness, Timothy's unwavering determination became her lifeline. Each word he spoke, each action he took, reinforced her resolve. Rowena found herself reflecting on how fate had led her to this moment. Betrayal and manipulation had defined her past, yet here she was, fighting for freedom alongside someone who truly saw her plight. Her heart swelled with gratitude, though tinged with sorrow. How long had she waited for someone to acknowledge her suffering? How many nights had she spent questioning if she deserved better? Timothy paused briefly, listening intently. His eyes scanned the corridor ahead, alert for any sign of danger. When he spoke again, his tone was calm but resolute. "We're close. Just hold on a little longer." She nodded weakly, drawing courage from his confidence. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a flicker of defiance reignite. No longer would she allow herself to be caged. Whatever lay ahead, she vowed to face it head on, with or without her captor's shadow looming over her. Together, they pressed onward, navigating twists and turns, until faint traces of moonlight seeped through cracks in the stone walls. Freedom was within reach, and with it came the promise of reclaiming her life. He led her down a set of narrow, crumbling stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The scent of damp earth and stone grew stronger as they descended further into the gloom. "There are old ways," he said, his voice steady and confident in the darkness. "Tunnels known only to the first builders of this fortress, meant for the escape of the royal line. They run deep beneath the foundations and emerge far beyond the outer walls in the lower valley. I can get you out. I have a safe house there. You'll be safe, and I can return to deal with the king." His words were smooth, flawless even, weaving a narrative that explained everything: the guards, the alarms, the king's madness, and their descent into the hidden depths. Rowena trusted him completely. She leaned on him, her mind fixated on one vivid image: the lower valley, home, safety, a place without alarms, without golden-eyed kings or suffocating bonds. She was being rescued. She was escaping. That fragile spark of hope, so tenuous moments before, now burned bright and desperate within her. They turned a corner, and the faint torchlight from the dungeon above vanished entirely, plunging them into near total darkness. The only sounds were their footsteps on the uneven stone and the distant, rhythmic drip of water echoing through the passage. She was utterly at his mercy, blindly following him deeper into the earth. They walked in the oppressive blackness for what felt like an eternity. Lord Timothy remained a solid, warm presence beside her, his grip firm and unwavering on her arm. He was her guide, her protector, her only lifeline. His steps were sure and deliberate on the uneven ground, and she clung to him with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. He had not faltered, not once, and he carried her fragile hope with him as they moved forward. The environment was suffocating. The passage was narrow, the walls slick with a cold, greasy dampness that made her skin crawl. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of old, wet rock, deep earth, and a faint metallic tang she couldn't identify. The only sounds were the soft scuff of Timothy's boots, the uneven shuffle of her own limping gait, and the steady, echoing drip of water from somewhere high above. For the first few minutes, Rowena felt relief. The terrible shrieking alarms were gone. The king's roars no longer reverberated through the halls. The agonizing pull of the bond still lingered, a dull, throbbing ache in her head and a hot pulse in her neck, but his immediate, overwhelming rage felt more distant. She was safe. She was with the beta, but something was wrong. They were not going up. Rowena knew mountains. A girl of the valley, she understood their logic. A fortress built on a mountain meant that escape required movement upward toward a gate level with the ground or higher. Yet they were only descending, relentlessly spiraling downward. The steps were shallow but constant, leading them deeper and deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, and the pressure in her ears began to build, as though they were sinking into a well. That small, bright flame of hope began to flicker and dim. Her instincts whispered warnings she could not ignore. Something about this path, this direction, felt wrong. Every step took them farther from the surface, farther from freedom. The weight of the mountain pressed down on her, both literal and metaphorical, squeezing the fragile hope from her chest. She tried to push the doubts aside, focusing instead on the warmth of Timothy's hand on her arm and the sound of his steady footsteps. He had promised her safety. He had promised her escape. But the relentless descent gnawed at her, planting seeds of unease that refused to be silenced. The darkness seemed alive, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. Each breath felt heavier than the last, the stale air clinging to her lungs. The rhythmic dripping of water became maddening, a metronome counting down to some unseen doom. Her thoughts spun in circles, torn between trust and suspicion. Could she truly rely on him? Was this path part of a greater plan, or a trap disguised as salvation? Still, she followed. What choice did she have? Above them lay the king's wrath, the alarms, the bonds that sought to chain her to a life she could no longer bear. Below them lay the unknown, perhaps safety or perhaps betrayal. Either way, she was powerless to turn back. Her fate rested in Timothy's hands, and all she could do was cling to the fragile thread of hope that he would lead her to freedom. "My lord," she whispered, her voice fragile and quivering, swallowed instantly by the lifeless silence around them. "Are you certain this is the right way? It feels as though we're descending further. Shouldn't we be ascending to escape?" "Patience, child," he replied, his tone still calm and steady, but edged with a sharpness that was unfamiliar to her. The ancient tunnels were crafted to remain concealed, burrowing beneath the outer walls and through the mountain's veins. We must descend before we rise. It is the only path to evade his guards. Trust me. She had no option but to trust him. Her breathing grew harsh and loud in the narrow passage, echoing her unease. Yet doubt, once sown, had taken root. This journey didn't feel like freedom. It felt like entrapment. His hand on her arm, once supportive, now felt different, firmer, not just guiding her, but restraining her, keeping her from pulling away. A chilling suspicion crept over her. more horrifying than the king's wrath. The king was a wild animal, his motives primal and clear. But this man was an enigma. The tunnel eventually leveled out. Timothy halted abruptly, and Rowena, leaning on him, stumbled to a stop beside him. She heard him fumbling with something, a metallic clink of keys. "Here we are," he said. His voice changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by a flat, emotionless tone. He pushed against something, and a heavy, iron-bound door groaned open on rusted hinges. The sound wasn't one of liberation. It was the sound of imprisonment. "The final passage," he declared, shoving her hard off his arm into the pitch-black space beyond. Rowena cried out as her balance failed her. She fell, landing painfully on the hard-packed earth. Her injured knee erupted in a blaze of searing agony. She scrambled back, her hands sinking into the cold, damp soil. Her heart racing with a terror unlike anything she'd known before. "No," she gasped, her voice strangled. This isn't a tunnel. It's a room." Lord Timothy stood in the doorway, his tall silhouette outlined against the faint gray light of the passage behind him. He was no longer her rescuer. He was her captor. "You're correct," he said, his voice unrecognizable. Gone was the kindness, the empathy, the reassurance, all stripped away to reveal the cold, bitter man beneath. "It's not an escape. It's a lesson." "What?" she choked, retreating until her back hit the cold, damp stone wall. "No, you said he was mad. You said you were helping me. You promised." "He is mad," Timothy spat, his voice dripping with venom that made her recoil. "A broken, grieving beast unfit to rule. And you are the chain he uses to choke himself." He stepped closer, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "I don't understand," she stammered. "He humiliated me," Timothy hissed, his resentment spilling forth like a dam breaking. The betrayal cut deep. His oldest friend, his beta, had turned against him in open court, siding with lesser wolves. Weakness, he thought. Now he would expose it to the entire Lycan world. The truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. This wasn't salvation. It was another prison. "He will hunt you," Timothy said, his voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "That bond you both hate will drive him. He'll tear this fortress apart stone by stone, searching for you, but he won't find you." He gestured around the room. These ancient cells were shielded, lined with iron, buried deep within the mountain's heart. He'll sense your terror, but he won't trace its origin. A mad king chasing shadows, while I, the loyal beta, hold what remains of the kingdom together as my poor grieving king succumbs to madness. No, please," she pleaded, tears streaming hot and fast down her face. "Let me go, please." Her words fell on deaf ears, dismissed as if she were nothing more than a pawn in his game. "I'll keep you here," he said coldly. "I'll break you, and I'll show everyone that their great alpha is too weak to even protect his mate. He's nothing." He laughed, a short, hollow sound devoid of humor, echoing through the tiny, dark cell. "He'll destroy this place looking for you, and you'll simply vanish." He stepped back toward the doorway. "No, please don't," she screamed, scrambling forward on hands and knees, her injured leg dragging uselessly behind her. But she was too late. The heavy, iron-banded door slammed shut with a thud that reverberated through her very bones. Then came the final, unbearable unbearable sound, the metallic scrape of a massive iron bar locking into place outside. Alone, trapped, buried alive, King Leonardo moved like a storm of rage and despair through the lower servants' quarters, a labyrinth of stale air and unyielding stone. The area lay in ruins, crates splintered, tables overturned, tapestries torn from the walls. His claws were worn blunt, his knuckles bloody from pounding the unforgiving rock. The bond between them was torture, an agonizing ache that spread through him like fog diffused in a blizzard. It offered no direction, only the faint echo of Rowena's terror, scattered and maddeningly vague. For hours, or maybe days, he ran in circles, primal instincts roaring at him while his human mind struggled to regain control. He was losing himself. Leaning against a cold stone wall, his chest heaved, breath hitching painfully. The fractured bond felt like a hollow void tearing at his core. Yet the shame of failure burned brighter than the physical pain. Where is she? With a guttural cry, he slammed his fist into the wall again. This time, a raw, broken sound escaped him, a growl tangled with a sob. And then it hit him. The dull, sprawling ache in his chest erupted into something sharper, fiercer, undeniable. It was no longer a dull throb. It had transformed into a single sharp spike of pure terror, incandescent and unrelenting. So violent, so potent that he roared, clutching his chest as though physically stabbed. This was a new kind of fear, not the breathless panic of being hunted, but the cold, hopeless dread of entrapment. It was betrayal in its rawest form, the suffocating despair of a cage door slamming shut. The sensation cut through his rage like lightning, burning away the fog of confusion with its intensity. The bond between them was no longer an ambiguous ache. It became a beacon, a screaming, singular line pointing downward, deep beneath him, into the very foundations of the mountain itself. His head snapped up, the pain crystallizing his focus. Alongside her terror came another flicker, an echo within the bond, a trace of cold triumph laced with bitter satisfaction. An emotion he recognized all too well, one he'd seen before in court. Timothy. The name exploded in his mind. Through their connection, he felt the ghostly presence of his beta, intertwined with Rowena's despair and Timothy's smugness. Leonardo's golden eyes flew open. Gone was the confusion, gone was the feral frustration. In their place emerged something far colder, a focused, absolute fury born for killing. He knew where she was, and he knew who held her captive. With unwavering purpose, he hurled himself from the wall, no longer merely hunting, but executing justice. His destination clear, he moved with precision. "Timothy!" he bellowed, but this time the name wasn't just a shout, it was a death sentence. Rowena found herself in a black, airless void, cold seeping into every inch of her body. The sound of the iron bar locking into place echoed like the ceiling of a tomb. She scrambled backward, hands sinking into damp earth until her back hit the rough stone wall. Trapped. Her terror transcended screaming. It paralyzed her completely. A dull heat pulsed at the mark on her neck, a cruel reminder of her agony. "He'll never find you, little bird," Lord Timothy sneered from beyond the heavy door. His voice dripped mockery. "Can you feel him, running around in circles while I hear his roars echoing through these halls. Pathetic. Rowena pressed her hands over her ears, sobs racking silently through her body, shredding her throat. This torment surpassed even the king's pursuit. At least his motives were primal, honest. But Timothy? Timothy reveled in cruelty. Outside, Leonardo descended deeper into the mountain, each step fueled by icy determination. Every fiber of his being thrummed with purpose. The bond guided him inexorably closer to her, magnifying both her anguish and his resolve. With each stride, memories surfaced, betrayals endured, trust broken, but they only stoked the fire within him. He would not falter now. As he neared, the oppressive darkness seemed to grow heavier, pressing against his senses. Yet nothing could deter him, not when her life hung precariously in the balance. Each heartbeat propelled him forward, bringing him nearer to confronting the one who dared defy him. Finally reaching the source of the signal, Leonardo paused momentarily outside a massive steel-reinforced door. Beyond it lay Rowena and Timothy. Gathering every ounce of strength, he unleashed a thunderous roar, shattering the barrier effortlessly. Light spilled into the cavernous space, illuminating Timothy standing over Rowena, his expression dripping arrogance. "Leonardo," Timothy spat, his tone venomous yet tinged with disbelief. "You're too late." But Leonardo didn't respond. Words weren't needed. Instead, he lunged forward, movement swift and lethal. The clash began immediately, primal forces colliding with ferocity unmatched. Blow after blow landed, neither yielding ground easily. Timothy fought dirty, leveraging underhanded tactics honed over years of deceit. Still, Leonardo remained relentless, driven by love and loyalty, not just to Rowena, but to those ideals he vowed to protect. Meanwhile, Rowena struggled to rise despite her weakened state. Watching the battle unfold ignited a spark within her. Though battered and bruised, she refused to remain passive. Summoning what little strength remained, she crawled toward a discarded weapon lying nearby. Back and forth the fight raged, neither side gaining significant advantage, until finally Leonardo seized control. With a mighty roar, he delivered a decisive blow, sending Timothy sprawling across the chamber. Defeated, Timothy stared up at him, defiance flickering briefly before fading entirely. Turning away from the broken figure, Leonardo rushed to Rowena, cradling her gently. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to him, relief washing over her in waves. They stayed like that for several moments, simply holding on to each other amidst the wreckage. When they eventually emerged from the depths, dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Exhaustion weighed heavily upon them, yet there was peace, a hard-earned tranquility forged through shared suffering. As they walked away together, leaving behind shadows and betrayal, hope bloomed anew. For though scars might linger, resilience bound them tightly, promising brighter days ahead. The icy, calculating malice of a man filled the air. Amid her despair, a new noise pierced through, a distant, rhythmic, and overwhelmingly powerful crash. It wasn't Timothy. Stone was yielding. Timothy heard it too, his taunting halting abruptly. "What?" he muttered, his usual arrogance faltering into sharp confusion. The crashing grew closer. It wasn't footsteps racing down the tunnel. Something was breaking through the wall. Rowena sensed it, an icy, focused, lethal fury. It was him. He wasn't roaring or wild. He was deliberate.
A force of nature, a controlled demolition. "Guards!" Timothy screamed, his voice now shrill with panic. "To me, now! He's here!" A final earth-shaking boom tore through the dungeon. The stone wall 10 feet from Rowena's cell exploded inward, sending granite and debris flying. Through the settling dust, silhouetted by torchlight, stood King Leonardo. Not a beast, but a king. Dust clung to him, his breathing steady. His eyes weren't feral gold, but a cold, murderous silver. He hadn't navigated the maze. He had carved a straight path. He saw Lord Timothy, frozen in disbelief and terror. "You," Timothy stammered, drawing a long dagger. "You're mad! She's poisoned you! I'm saving the kingdom!" Leonardo ignored him, his gaze locked on the iron-barred cell door. "You are doing nothing," he said, his voice calm and deadly. He stepped forward. "No!" Timothy shouted, his arrogance flaring in one last desperate attempt. "She's the poison. I'm saving us." He lunged, not at the king, but at the cell door, trying to bar it again. Leonardo moved like a shadow. He didn't strike Timothy, but brushed past him, slamming his shoulder into the beta's chest, sending him sprawling into the wall. Unstoppable, Leonardo reached the door. The massive iron bar was secured by thick anchors sunk deep into the stone. He gripped the door and pulled. Timothy, scrambling up, watched in horror. "It's barred! It's impossible!" With a sound of tortured metal, Leonardo tore the door, bar and all, from the wall. Centuries-old anchors ripped free in a cascade of granite and mortar. For a moment, he held the 1,000-pound door, then hurled it aside, where it crashed against the far wall. The cell was open. Rowena sat there, small and pale, blinking in the sudden torchlight. Timothy, watching his plans crumble, let out a howl of rage. Leonardo moved with incredible speed, his reflexes a blur as he spun around to face the threat. He caught Timothy's wrist just as the dagger was about to strike, his grip unyielding like iron. The sharp crack of bone echoed through the narrow tunnel, followed by Timothy's agonized scream. His weapon fell to the ground with a clatter. "I taught you that move, old friend," Timothy gasped, his voice trembling with both pain and anger as he cradled his broken hand. "You always favored your left." "You are not my friend," Leonardo replied, his tone devoid of warmth or mercy. This wasn't the grieving king speaking now. This wasn't even the feral beast driven by emotion. No, this was something else entirely. The Protector. His fury burned cold and focused, an inhuman force honed by purpose and righteousness. Timothy, desperate and defiant despite his injury, lunged forward again, his shifter claws extending toward Leonardo's throat. But he misjudged his opponent. The man before him was no longer lost in grief. Instead, he fought with the precision of someone fueled by clarity and conviction. Leonardo didn't dodge or block. He met the attack head on. With one swift motion, he grabbed Timothy by the throat, lifted him off the ground, and slammed him into the stone wall. The impact reverberated sickeningly through the confined space. Rowena watched from her cell, pressing herself against the cold dirt wall, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a gasp. Here were the two most powerful shifters in the kingdom, locked in a brutal fight to the death, and she was at the heart of it all. She felt responsible for everything unraveling before her eyes. "She made you weak," Timothy choked out, his legs flailing uselessly as Leonardo tightened his grip.
"No," Leonardo growled, his face inches from Timothy's. "She made me whole. There would be no honorable warrior's death for Timothy, not today." Leonardo didn't unsheath his claws or deliver a fatal blow with them. Instead, he drove his fist into Timothy's chest repeatedly, each punch landing with devastating force. Bones cracked under the assault, sounding like dry branches snapping. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was destruction. Cold, methodical, and merciless. Every strike was calculated, every movement deliberate. He was dismantling the man who had dared threaten what mattered most to him. Finally, Leonardo released him, letting Timothy collapse onto the floor in a broken heap. His arm lay twisted at an unnatural angle, his breathing shallow and wet. Leonardo stood over him, his chest heaving, claws sliding free from his knuckles, glinting menacingly in the torchlight. He raised his hand, ready to deliver the final blow. "No," Rowena whispered, her voice barely audible, yet cutting through the chaos like a knife. Her tiny plea froze Leonardo mid-motion. The rage in his eyes flickered, warring with something newer, softer, an emotion stirred by her fear. He heard her. Through the storm of his own fury, he heard her. He looked down at Timothy, beaten and broken, then turned his gaze toward Rowena, cowering in terror within her cell. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped back. The wolf inside him howled for blood, demanding the kill, but her terror pierced deeper than any blade ever could. Reluctantly, he retracted his claws, their metallic sound soft but unmistakable in the silence. "Guards!" Leonardo bellowed, his voice thundering through the passageway. The sound of rushing footsteps answered almost immediately. The royal guard arrived at the end of the tunnel, their faces pale as they witnessed the aftermath of the destruction. "Take this, traitor," Leonardo commanded, his voice trembling with a controlled fury more chilling than open rage. "Take him to the high dungeon. He will await the court's judgment. Do not harm him further. Do not speak to him. Leave him in solitude." The guards, stunned into silence, dragged the battered and groaning Timothy to his feet. As they hauled him away, Timothy's hate-filled gaze locked onto Leonardo's. Unfazed, Leonardo watched him go, his face an unreadable mask. The hall fell silent, except for Rowena's panicked breaths echoing from the shadows. The guards were gone. Timothy was gone. Only she remained. He turned toward her, stepping into the dim light. His towering silhouette filled the ruined doorway of her cell, illuminated by flickering torchlight. A fine layer of stone dust clung to him, his black tunic torn, his knuckles bruised and bloodied from the fight. His silver eyes burned, not cold or feral, but alive with a raw intensity that was almost unbearable to behold. This was the man who had just dismantled his oldest friend, and now that same focus was directed at her. He moved closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. Rowena screamed, a sound devoid of words, a primal cry of sheer terror. It was the noise of something cornered, knowing death was imminent. She recoiled so violently, her head struck the stone wall behind her, hands flying up instinctively to shield herself. Shaking uncontrollably, she could barely stay upright. To her, he wasn't a rescuer. He was the final monster. Her scream hit him like a physical blow, freezing him mid-step, 1 foot inside the cell. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The man who had torn through fortress walls, and subdued a shifter, stood immobilized. In that moment, his humanity, buried under layers of grief and primal fury, crashed back into place. He no longer saw a mate to claim. Instead, he saw a traumatized girl cowering before him. He saw the consequences of his actions, the claiming, the hunt, the roars, all reflections of the fear he had instilled, and it dawned on him with devastating clarity. He was the source of her terror. He looked down at his hands, still stained with blood, his claws partially extended, a low-level possessive reflex. His wolf surged within, snarling with pride, urging him to take what belonged to him. She is safe. Take her. She is ours. But she wasn't safe. She was terrified of him. He refused to become the beast Timothy accused him of being, refused to embody the monster she saw. Closing his eyes, he fought to steady his breathing. Rowena, peeking through trembling fingers, saw him standing there like a statue caught between warring instincts. His body vibrated with power he struggled to contain. Every fiber of his being stretched taut in an internal battle. A deep, guttural growl resonated from his chest, not born of anger, but of an intense internal struggle. Slowly, painfully, he willed his claws to retract. The sharp KT sound echoed in the stillness. He opened his eyes, and the primal fire that had consumed them was gone. They were silver now, filled with an unfamiliar, raw emotion that burned through him. His hand, the right one, was outstretched. It was the same hand that had struck Timothy, the same hand that had torn a door from its hinges. Bruised, bloodied, and caked in grime, it trembled violently, shaking with the sheer effort of his restraint. He was wrestling with his instincts, his nature, his very essence for her sake. His palm faced upward, an offering rather than a demand. "I will not hurt you," he rasped, his voice shredded and broken, as though each word clawed its way out of his throat. "You are mine," he choked, swallowing hard, the words bitter on his tongue. "Mine to protect, not to terrorize." Rowena stared at the hand before her. It belonged to the monster, the king, the beast who had claimed her. Blood and dust coated it, and it shook uncontrollably. What struck her most wasn't his power or his rage. It was his control, his restraint. He was a force of nature holding himself back, battling his own instincts for her. He wasn't taken, he was offering. This wasn't the feral creature who had claimed her in darkness. This was a man striving to become something different. The bond between them still hummed within her, a living wire pulsing quietly now instead of screaming with his fury. In the cold silence of the dungeon, with her enemy defeated and her fear acknowledged, it no longer felt like a chain binding her. It felt solid, alive, warm, a lifeline in this bleak, desolate world. He didn't move closer. He didn't pressure her. He simply waited, his hand trembling, his body straining under the weight of his effort. He was giving her a choice, her first real choice, not to flee, not to hide, not to react, but to act. Slowly, her own hand rose from her lap, shaking as much as his. Nothing had ever terrified her more, not even running from the ceremony. She inched forward, her injured knee scraping against the dirt, until she placed her small, dirty hand into his. The moment their skin touched, a surge of blinding energy jolted through them both. The fractured bond, the agonizing wound that had screamed in their chests, sealed itself instantly. It wasn't violent or forceful. Instead, it was a quiet, profound connection, like two pieces clicking perfectly into place. The searing pain vanished, replaced by a deep warmth so overwhelming it stole their breath. Leonardo's knees gave out beneath him. His breath caught sharply, eyes squeezing shut as his fingers clutched her hand with desperate strength, as though it were the sole anchor keeping him upright. Slowly, he collapsed to one knee in the dirt before her. She didn't pull away. Fear still lingered in her, but the weight of solitude had lifted. Days later, the Lycan court convened. In the grand hall, Lord Timothy stood, his body healed, but his spirit shattered. Stripped of his titles, his lands, and even his name, he was condemned to spend the rest of his days in the darkest, most secure cell of the high dungeon. From a shadowed alcove above, Rowena observed silently, wrapped in a heavy fur-lined blanket. Her skin was clean, her body safe, yet fragility still clung to her like a second skin. Beside her stood King Leonardo, his presence steady and warm, like an unyielding shield. He did not reach for her or invade her space. Instead, he simply stood guard, his vow to protect her tangible in its quiet resolve. That evening, within the king's expansive chambers, a fire crackled in the hearth, banishing the chill from the room. Rowena sat in a chair, choosing it over the plush furs, carving out her own small territory. Leonardo stood by the window, gazing at the moonlight spilling across the horizon. The silence between them stretched long, but it carried no hostility. It was delicate, like glass on the verge of shattering. "You are safe here, Rowena," he said finally, his voice low and rough, carrying the echoes of pain still fresh within him. "You are safe." She turned to look at him then. Gone was the distant figure who once haunted the throne, the menacing specter lurking in shadows. Before her now stood a man burdened by his own sorrow, shaped by the connection that had grown between them. "I know," she murmured softly. It wasn't trust, not yet. It wasn't love. But the bond between them, fractured and fragile for so long, had begun to mend. For the first time, in the stillness of the chamber, it felt like something new was taking root. A beginning, tentative and uncertain, yet whole in its warmth.